Remember Dear Abby? The syndicated advice column from, I think it started in 1956. So we're going to begin today with a little bit of trivia. First question. Anyone know where the pen name Abigail Van Buren came from? Kelly, do we have a lot of hands on Zoom? Oh, we have somebody here who knows. Tony offers that, is it a president's wife? Didn't we have a president named Van Buren? Martin Van Buren. So the Van Buren comes from the president's surname, but turns out that the Abigail comes from the biblical figure Abigail that we heard Pat and Carol proclaim from the book of Samuel today. So this is according to Pauline Phillips, who was the original Dear Abby. Now her daughter, Jean, I think picked up for her in late '87 and is still Dear Abby. I, of course, did not realize Dear Abby was still out there because I'm not really into newsprint, but it's available online if anyone's interested. So 2 Jewish girls from Iowa end up famous. Turns out that Pauline had a twin. Second question, I have somebody here has already, before I even offer the question, has said the answer. Terry Shields offered that Ann Landers was Pauline's twin sister, and it's true. Her name's actually Esther, but okay. So now we're closing the trivia portion of today's homily. But let's shift the focus from advice columnists of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to the Abigail, whose story from scripture inspired the Dear Abby name. And turns out that this Abigail, the one that Carol and Pat proclaimed today, she holds the distinction of being the only woman in the Hebrew Bible who's described as an intelligent and attractive woman. Isn't that pathetic? So commentators have referred to her as wise and prophetic. A show of hands, though. How many of us remember hearing about Abigail before today? Eileen DeFranco. Okay. Kelly, anybody on Zoom? Okay. So to set the scene, it's sheep shearing season. So it's back to the sheep, right? David, before he became king, runs what we'd refer to today as a protection racket against the marauders for the shepherds and the flocks in the area around the ancient Israelite town of Carmel. So David's people ask Nabal, a wealthy property owner and a bit of a scoundrel, to extend hospitality to David and his followers. But Nabal, Abigail's husband, arrogantly refuses, choosing instead to insult and question why he'd give anything to people coming from God knows where. So since Nabal violated the cultural code of hospitality, David chooses to retaliate with his army of 400. Exactly. So enter into this scene Abigail, who's been approached by one of the concerned shearers who works with her stubborn husband and asked to intervene because they know they'll be wiped out. It's kind of hard, 400 people to a household, right? Abigail acts quickly without her husband's knowledge, packing a feast of 200 loaves of bread, massive casks of wine, roasted sheep, raisin and fig cakes. Actually, just mentioning this makes me hungry. right? And takes off on donkey to find David and his entourage of 400. Abigail dismounts, prostrates herself, and pleads with David, accepting the blame for Nabal's failure and referencing Nabal as the embodiment of his name, which means fool, and suggesting that David and everyone with him enjoy the feast that she has provided. Alas, David appears to experience a change of heart, and we're glad. He accepts the generous feast and blesses God and Abigail for saving him from the guilt of bloodshed, that of killing everyone in Nabal's household. Abigail literally places her body and blood on the line for her ungrateful husband, their servants, their livestock, and their home. Body and blood offered, body and blood saved. A courageous woman, Abigail was all in. She went so far as to arrange for the feast to be transported. At the intersection of hospitality, eating, and dialogue, real presence can happen. Now, of course, like in all of our stories, there's more to the story. And if you read on for a couple of verses beyond where our reading ended today, you learn that when Abigail went home, her husband was drunk. And so she chose not to engage with him, which frankly is a good strategy for people who live with people who drink a lot. So the next day she shared with him where he went, and apparently he was not happy. So upset was he that, depends on what translation you read, but it sounds as if he had a health event, let's call it a heart attack, and went into a coma, and 10 days later he died. Yeah. Okay, so David finds out, and guess what? Then Abigail becomes David's third wife. So, all right, there's always more to the story, but okay. Put that aside, right? Maybe that's why we even know that she was attractive. I don't know. So often I quote Sister of St. Joseph, Mary McGlone, and I really enjoy her writings in the National Catholic Reporter. So she observes, quote, when we consider the experience of eating and drinking, we become aware of two things. The first is that eating and drinking are absolutely necessary for life. Anyone questioning that? No. And the second, what we eat becomes a part of us. It literally becomes our flesh and blood. So although we rarely consider it, the most intimate connection we have in life is with what we eat. So I invite you to consider what you believe about the real presence of Christ among us as food for our journeys. The ritual act of the Eucharist that we gather each Sunday to celebrate is a gift to help us see the reality of God's presence in the world, to see it more clearly and live it more convincingly. The invitation is to let ourselves be broken down, just like the wheat or rice or whatever is in the bread that we eat, and the crushed grapes in the wine. Perhaps like Abigail and David, we come together when there's a breakdown. We become the real presence of Christ by the way we live our lives, by the way that we love, by the way that we treat people, all people. Like the bread and wine, each of us are meant to be changed, to become the bread of brokenness and the cup of vulnerability. That's why we call it communion. So going forward, rather than advice, maybe Abigail, who now also will be known as Dear Abby, might inspire you to change and take courageous action around the issues that disrupt our lives and our world, in our families, in our communities. Maybe that's what I take from the story of Abigail. Remain blessed.